Hi, and welcome back. Our topic today is the evolving place of women in the United Church of Canada. And again, this week, our approach is going to be less linear than we might have used on other topics. This is what historians refer to as longitudinal study, looking at a particular topic but over a space of time rather than in a specific set of years. And so we're going to be dipping in a variety of places that will give us a flavor of this rich and varied story. We're going to be looking at questions like, why did women's groups appear? What did they offer their members above and beyond regular church life? And why did they thrive? Now, excellent books have been written about the WA, the WMS, and the UCW, and there is a flood of articles. Now, I'm not going to rehearse all of that, but I want to draw out a few things for you. First, let's ground ourselves in the reality of a different time. It may be difficult for us from the perspective of the second decade of the 21st century to imagine a society largely without social welfare, no allowances of any kind, no hospital insurance, no unemployment insurance, no disability funding, no sick leave. But before the existence of those on a societal basis, the women of the church were responding to need and doing Christ's work. They were healing the sick, clothing the naked, housing those who had no shelter, feeding the hungry, visiting the downtrodden, teaching the marginalized, and comforting the bereaved. The Halifax Wesleyan Female Benevolent Society had the following purpose statement: to relieve the wants, assuage the griefs, and mitigate the suffering of many of the wretched and destitute of our fellow creatures. They were organized as early as 1816 to cope with the severe economic depression that hit Halifax following the Napoleonic Wars. Society members distributed clothing that they had made themselves, blankets, and food packages to households where breadwinners were either unemployed or absent. They sought donations of money and goods from local merchants, and in the first year of their existence, the society had collected over $1,000, which in 1816 was a truly significant sum of money, and they had relieved 300 distressed situations. Within the first 2 years, the Society's charity had been extended to thousands, Methodists and non Methodists alike. They served communities in times of need, but they also extended their work beyond the local scene. For instance, maritime women sent support to in the forms of barrels of clothes and salt cods to the prairie provinces in times of drought. And this enormous relief effort was largely based on the organizing drive of a single woman named Annie Ignatieff, who was the president of the Presbyterial Women's Association in Assiniboine Presbytery. Now, at various times of economic distress and collapse, many people would literally have not survived dignity intact without the efforts of these women. Soup kitchens and bread lines were often organized on an ecumenical basis. Blankets, clothing, and fuel were provided to those unable to attain such necessities of life. Other churchwomen taught their sisters how to sew, provided fabric and patterns so that women could sew clothes for their families and perhaps earn a little money to add to very meager household funds. The two world wars saw women organizing to support the war effort. Now, this may or may not challenge our more pacifist inclinations. The reality of the national effort was truly immense. Bandages were being made by every women's group in the country for distribution by the Red Cross. Soldiers received packages from home with baked goods and preserves and homemade delicacies, hand knitted socks and caps. Soldiers and sailors in Canada were taken in, and in places like Halifax and Vancouver and Victoria, there is a rich local memory of activities organized for thousands of men torn away from their homes, all this put on by the church. They cheered the return of their local soldiers after the war, and in many communities they set up special groups to welcome the war brides who came with the returning soldiers. They responded to local disasters with generosity and creativity. The history book of First St. Andrew's United Church in London, Ontario, tells of a flooding when a breakwater was broken through in the 1930s, flooding much of the city. And so the women of the church ran a dining room and a nursery in the parlor and made over clothing for their unexpected guests on sewing machines laid out in the boardroom. And similar stories could be repeated with local variations all across Canada. Some groups formed through a very conscious response to Christ's call, and this is evident in some of their purpose statements: to serve God and fellow men, to visit the sick and the needy, to help lighten another's burdens by kindly deeds. Now, the impact of individual women and women's groups on church and society cannot be overstated. However, it's only in the last 20 to 30 years that large numbers of historians have taken up the investigation into those records, particularly for the church. As one feminist historian writes, women tend to be very modest about their contributions to the church. We've already mentioned in a couple of occasions the whole role of women in the social gospel and the temperance movement, and a reminder that this was not because of any particular puritanical moral stance around drinking, but because a concern about societal needs. Rapidly increasing consumption of liquor was evidently at the root of significant problems, particularly for women and children who suffered the results in abuse and the lack of financial resources for basic necessities. In 1895, the president of the local Women's Missionary Society in Prince Edward Island wrote as follows: Canada spends $80 million on liquor, which is an average of $16 per capita, while against that, Canada gives only $500,000 to missions, which amounts to 10 cents per capita. This is a striking level of analysis that women are engaging in, recognizing the contrast between $16 per capita spent on liquor and 10 cents per capita spent on alcohol. And it also gives us an appreciation of the extent and the scope of the problem. Another issue that was particularly gripping for women were issues related to world peace. Now, after many years of praying together for the Interdenominational Day of Prayer for Mission, it began officially in 1918, and it gathered for collective prayer in World War I and II. In 1922, Canadian women joined their American sisters, and the Women's World Day of Prayer, now simply called the World Day of Prayer, was born as a truly international event. Now, these are all pre-union events in most cases. They were making statements about peace within their congregations. For the greater part of the 19th century, most Canadian women had no access to formal education, with the exception of those ornamental graces which prepared her for what was seen as a woman's highest sphere, that of a wife and mother. Mount Allison was the first Canadian institution to admit women to bachelor's level studies, and it is, of course, a Methodist and later United Church of Canada foundation. It was that institution that granted the first Bachelor of Science and English Literature degree to Grace Annie Lockhart in 1875. In the context of a society that discouraged women from formal education, an interest in missions provided a possible and, if somewhat unconscious, countercultural outlet for those intellectual desires. Women with inquiring minds could make the prevailing values work in their favor. They gathered together, they learned about missionaries and the countries to which they had gone. Women in Antigonish, for example, had been interested in missions since 1846, when one of their sisters, Charlotte MacDonald Getty, had sailed with her husband to the New Hebrides. So, when the women were called together by the minister in 1878, and it was suggested that they form an auxiliary of the Halifax Women's Foreign Missionary Society, the response was unanimous support. In 1941, the women of St. Andrew's Church in Toronto formed two book clubs that took very seriously educational needs and the needs of women for intellectual stimulation. There's a famous quote that says, "Education is a child of religion," and that's certainly been true for the United Church of Canada. Until the 20th century, the church was virtually the only acceptable context in which a woman could stretch their intellectual framework. And so women liberated themselves and others through study, both of the Bible and of other sources. They came to trust in their own interpretation. Now, new groups that are formed in the 21st century may be in uncharted areas, but they continue the trajectory of women pushing the boundaries as they seek to grow. The mission of church women's organization was to meet the needs of socialization. In a society where most women, they often found themselves isolated, and so church women's organization offered an opportunity for crucial social connection. In rural communities particularly, these groups formed the means of social support, particularly for women trapped in abusive marriages. They were also responsive and supportive in times of sickness, bereavement, death, and so on, and often behind the scenes. Where the men found themselves unwilling or unable to accept the support of others, women handled those difficult times in much healthier fashion. Church women organized, planned, cooked, and served community suppers all across Canada, and those would often be the social highlight of the year, attracting people from across the community regardless of denominational affiliation. And this was particularly true and important in farming communities, where farmed families often lived at considerable distance from their neighbors. In many different places, women's groups sponsored classes and gatherings for mothers so that they could aid one another with the challenges and joys of child rearing. When we put the concept of community for church women in the center of our consideration, we also understand why quilting was a popular focus. Gathered around the quilt frame, there was ample time for socializing. It was both productive and therapeutic. Less acknowledged at the time was the role of women within political action. The status of women in the church evolved throughout this period, but certainly began without official status. So forming a special interest group for women was a consciously political action. The women of the Halifax Wesleyan Women's Society could have come together informally to conduct their charitable work. Money could have been raised, missions supported, and friendly visits undertaken without a formal structure. But the women consciously chose to gather under a particular name as a continuing presence, not only within their own congregation, but with the entire Methodist Conference. Now, imagining these women's groups as politically radical and subversive may be a stretch for you, but in the 19th century they were exactly that, and they were very carefully watched over by clergy and laymen alike. One minister, after opening the meeting with prayer, since women were not allowed to pray in public at this time, was then invited to leave. He declined, saying, quote, "No one would know what they would pray for if I left them alone." End of quote. Now, this was written about a women's meeting in 1811 in the United States, but in Canada there was very little difference in attitude. It was a very daring idea for women in that day to draw up rules and even have a name. That was the response of the Halifax Wesleyan Women's Society that I mentioned earlier. And there was heated debate after a mothers' meeting was organized in 1900 to do the work of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was denounced by people in the press. One self-identified Methodist man wrote, quote, "for the good of society," and he commented that this was an entirely inappropriate thing for women to do. There were times when the women struggled with the church board or wanted the permission of the session to hold a bridal shower. In other areas of church life, they struggled, particularly with the prevailing attitude that they were non-primary human beings who, in the proper ordering of things, could continue to devote themselves to the support and comfort of those human beings who were considered primary, namely their husbands and their fathers. So when we put that together, it's quite astonishing that in that social context, women accomplished as much as they did. And it is with a growing sense of their own calling and mission that we begin to see the development of different structures and quite deliberate and often very creative strategies to overcome gender discrimination. For example, the issue of inclusive language is one that Methodist women in 1906 would have been very familiar. At the Methodist General Council, that would be the National Gathering of Canadian Methodists in 1894, the presidents of the Ladies' Aid were admitted to quarterly board meetings. In other words, the president of the local Ladies' Aid Society was now a member of the local governing body. In 1906, a motion was introduced to change the term from layman to lay member. This would automatically admit women to church courts. Now, it was a vote that was defeated, but only by 42 votes, so we can see that the times were changing. Organizations and structures strengthened the role of women in the church, both individually and collectively. The first women to sit on sessions and boards usually were there as representatives of their groups, and many congregations did not admit them as members in their own right until much later. When the UCW, United Church Women, was formed in 1962, the participation of women in decision-making bodies was written into the manual. While the church was dominated in numbers by women, its leadership was dominated by men until comparatively recently. One of the striking features of the women's movement was their continuing ability to generate funds, which sharply contradicts the societal myth of the time that women had no heads for such things. The fact that the myth continues is perhaps a testimony to how deeply it was lodged in the popular psyche, both male and female. The many ways used to raise money simply boggle the imagination. Quilting, book sales, rummage sales, bazaars, plant sales, economy stores, auctions, catering, church and community suppers, and the list goes on and on and on. But despite the evidence to the contrary, women in the time did not see themselves as engaged in business, nor does the local church or the national church seem to have truly given credit for the scope of what was undertaken. We see a unique blending of creativity, initiative, and faith. For instance, they wrote cookbooks, had them printed, and set out, generating what might individually seem like small amounts of money, but they were constantly generating these funds. And certainly many congregations would not exist without those efforts. The care and upkeep of churches and manses also fell to them most of the time, scrubbing floors, polishing brass, washing windows, and so on. When the Women's Foreign Missionary Society in the Western Division was formed by the Presbyterians in 1876, there were some male ministers who actually expressed the fear that their congregational finances would suffer because the women's focus would be elsewhere. That simply didn't happen. Canadian women developed the habit of double giving. And the fear of the clergy, however sincerely meant, suggests a more deeply held fear that organizations engaged in God's work would be competitive rather than supportive of the church, which is a particularly harsh judgment on generations of church women who simply did not have access to the structures of the church and therefore had to heed the call to mission in other ways, in other forms. The doubts that church men had about these organizations were quickly challenged by the remarkable ability the women showed both in administration and in fundraising without disrupting local finances. Money and all that it accomplishes was tangible evidence that women had an active and meaningful place in the church and was important as a source of self-esteem. But that did not quickly lead to women's involvement in the elected leadership of the church. Another major recipient of the role of women as fundraiser has been the Mission and Service Fund. And the United Church Women has long held the Mission and Service Fund as a major focus for its work and has contributed to it strongly over the decades. When we consider that throughout much of this period, women had very little access to money on their own, the amounts that they had been able to raise for their church and its missions is absolutely astounding. For most women, it has not been a matter of transferring money earned elsewhere to church coffers, but turning wit, skills, imagination, and raw materials into cold, hard cash. Domestic skills such as cooking, sewing, knitting became major sources of income, raising literally millions of dollars. Some enterprising groups actually moved their operations outside the church, for example, catering at local and community functions, operating second-hand clothing stores on a full-time basis. They developed creative ideas for raising money without a large initial cash outlay. Periodic penny per inch waistline measurements were done in some groups, or they issued sunshine bags into which members put pennies on nice days. A traveling apron went from person to person and each woman sewed a coin into it. The Sunday egg program of a group of women in Manitoba paid for the creation of a basement in their church, and the list goes on and on and on. And what we see in broad strokes is the use of particular domestic skills which were not highly valued in the male-dominated society as a whole, but they became resources for life-giving activities. Ironically, in many cases, the money earned was still handed over to the church men to be spent. This was done and for many years does not seem to have raised any comment or protest. In the records of the Victoria Church, we read, "The products of the Thanksgiving fowl supper are always turned over to the church treasurer by the UCW, a gallant band of hard-working women who do much towards the upkeep of the church and the manse." Disposition of money in this way was at least not overtly problematic in those days, as it certainly would be today, when women have the opportunity to be parts of boards, committees, trustees, and so on. But for most of the period that we are considering, this was not the case. I know of one congregation that in the last decade elected its first woman trustee. So these things move very, very slowly, as we well know. But we also find examples of women pushing back against the prevailing expectations. For instance, we read in the minutes of a women's group in Kamloops, BC in 1925, a motion, quote, that the Board of Managers ask the men to take the congregational social in hand, as the energy of the women was being taken up with preparations for the bazaar, end of quote. These women apparently felt comfortable telling the managers what to do, but that was not a widespread sentiment. Now, establishing a separate fund was another tactic, and when the board asked to borrow money from the UCW, the women would occasionally say no, and they'd establish a separate fund for those things that they valued, which they saw to be undervalued by the church's leadership. Interestingly, fundraising was largely accepted. But when women attempted to form study groups which were free of fundraising activities, that often met with opposition. That women could get together to study and not raise funds was problematic and still is today in certain places. In some research papers, the difficulty church women have in curtailing their fundraising activities in order to focus elsewhere is clearly noted. Nationally, the WMS, Women's Missionary Society, was a freestanding organization with its own funds, administration, and personnel. They were full partners in national church bodies, a status which they lost when the Women's Association and the WMS were merged into the UCW in 1962. While the WA had the larger memberships, the WMS was the more visible national presence. It was thought that the combination would draw on the strength of both organizations. However, the conclusion seems to be that many of the overseas functions of the WMS were absorbed by the national church, and hence women lost their direct control and authority over something that had been the lifeblood of a very vibrant organization. Now, when we speak of church union, we are, of course, speaking about the uniting of different groups, and we're doing so from the perspective of the United Church of Canada. Some of you may wish to do further exploration of the response, particularly in the continuing Presbyterian Church. For many Canadians, union was a rupture in their churches and their families. Now, there's very little written about the union from the perspective of women. Of the 342 official signers of the basis of union, only 4 were women. Unofficially, the women of the churches would have been deeply affected by the intense lobbying activities from both sides. They were also the focus of pamphlets like Read and Decide from Montreal Presbytery, which we read a few weeks ago. They were part of the background conversation, even in those places where they did not officially vote. The independent women's organizations in all of the churches were thriving, so any argument from economics or the viewpoint of dwindling numbers and resources would, in fact, not apply to them. Changing our focus slightly, we note that in the early years of the 20th century, Canada began to prosper and grow. Immigration rose from 17,000 in 1896 to 200,000 in 1906. These are annual figures. And it began to include many Eastern Europeans, many of whom were settled in the prairie provinces, but they also found their ways into the cities that began to attract youth into better paying jobs in industry. We've talked about the growth of missions and mission work in Canada under the rubric of the social gospel movement. The women were involved in a variety of social organizations, as we saw, and consensus, cooperation, and local union seemed to ensure the very easy formation of the new denomination. Of course, as we've seen, the struggle was quite bitter in some places. During the First World War, Canada entered the struggle with the blessings of the denominations, and many congregations, particularly Methodist, established recruiting stations, and there were large numbers of sermons encouraging young men to enlist in a holy cause. One quote, "Any young man who did not go to war but could was neither a Christian nor a patriot," end of quote. The war effort involved huge expenditures of effort by women in relief and support roles, both at home and abroad. The fight for prohibition continued with the triumph of Canada becoming completely dry in 1919. It's very difficult from our perspective and our time to recognize the impact that the end of the war and the return of the troops marked as a change in Canadian society. One of the realities was that it changed people's attitudes to the goodness of life and of humanity. Increasingly sophisticated manufacturing techniques, which had been developed in the 19th century and had been improving the lot of life for many people, had also been used to devastating effect on the battlefield. So the fair and just society of which many had dreamed seemed to go by the wayside. It was also significant that, in a per capita basis, Canada lost more soldiers fighting in World War I than any other part of the Commonwealth. And so people had not only learned that technology could be a force for evil as well as for good, many communities had most of a generation of men simply wiped away. The role of the church, particularly in relation to establishing the morals of the society, shifted as well. Soldiers had become used to fewer restrictions while they were overseas, and they were reluctant to surrender those newfound freedoms back to the church. At the same time, the changed role of women in the workforce during the war and the spread of various technical innovations made major changes to family life and the way in which women used their time. This in turn contributed to an increased sense of independence. Competent persons, as they had taken on crucial roles in industry and commerce, winning the Dominion vote in 1917. Canada could no longer deny that women were primary citizens, just like men, even if legally they were not yet persons until the important decision in 1929. In 1936, after a decade of debate, Lydia Grucci was ordained. The controversy over women's roles seems to have raised the consciousness of some congregations because it's during that time that some churches admitted women to the session for the first time. And even strong opposition in some places. We see forward movement in others. As I said, this lecture was not an attempt to recapture all of the material in your texts and primary sources. It was meant to give you some glimpses, some highlights of an important and a fascinating story that continues to evolve this day.